I'm Ralf. I'm research assistant at the Leibniz Institute for Research on Society and Space in Erkner. This is a small town at the margins of Berlin. Apart or besides my affiliation, I'm urban and regional sociologist. I investigate urban and regional transformations, and I'm interested just to get to know how people or groups of people respond to challenges that occur in transformation processes. I'm also interested in getting to know how distinctive are cities and regions, and how this distinctiveness, this cultural distinctiveness, shapes people in their thoughts and practices. I'm interested to investigate social innovation conceptions, social enterprises, and also migration paths. So these are typical fields of activities. So rural areas in Germany, but I think also in other countries in Europe at least, are characterized, I would say, what is very obvious, that they have undergone a massive social change in the last decades, you can say. So maybe this social change is even bigger than it was in big cities. So for instance, we observe a strong or a deep de-agrarization. So today only about 2% of the people who are living in rural places still work in the agricultural sector. We have observed a strong modernization. So today female role models, for instance, are not so important anymore as it was 50 or 40 years ago. Young people who grow up in the countryside are not anymore so much, bound to expectations of their families. So they are much more free in their own personal decisions, what they are going to do. We observe also that the social structure in rural places has totally changed. So in the past we have a more or less very hierarchical social system with few families who are very powerful in villages because they have a long family tradition in their places or their own land. Today the system has totally changed. We observed processes like automobilization, so distances shrinked a lot, and people are much more mobile than they were in, 50, 60 years ago, and so on. So it has really, the traditional way of rural life has totally changed. And this makes it also really interesting to deal with rural places as a social scientist. Of course, rural places face several also economic challenges. I find that maybe one of the most important or pressing problems is a certain lack of well-qualified employees in rural places. Not in all rural places, but in many of them. And this is due maybe first that we observe and we call it educational expansion. This means that young people, much bigger parts than it was in the past of young people go to secondary school, go to university, and going to university usually means that you leave your rural places, and only a small share of people who once left for educational purposes go back and go to rural places. And this is really a problem for these areas because these qualified people are missing there. And maybe what we also observed, but more in Eastern European countries, is that they also lack of qualified workforces, but for other reasons. There we observe that many of them went to Western European countries for earning money because their salaries are much bigger or much higher. And we conducted research, for example, in the northeast of Poland, which is a really rather poor area, and even there they missed a lot of qualified people. So like construction workers or electricians, which are very typical male professions in this area, but yeah, nowadays it's not easy for them to have enough workforces, and this has also strong consequences for rural development. For me, social innovation are novel solutions that promise to tackle social problems or challenges better than it would be possible with means that are already at hand. So, and what I find also important when I talk about social innovations, that it are not just novel ideas or conceptions, but I would speak of social innovation only if people or groups of people are aware of this new solution and adopt it somehow. So it's a question of thoughts and practices. And if this is not reflected in, these novelties are not reflected in practices and thoughts, then it wouldn't be an innovation from my point of view. So, and what I would also say is that social innovation has kind of a double nature. So on the one hand, it is an empirical phenomenon. You can observe it. You can observe when people develop something new and try to establish this solution. And at the same time, it's also an analytical conception, so which is important for me as a social scientist to have certain terms and notions which help me to describe what I observe. And this, I would say, rather maybe also analytical understanding of social innovation is somehow different to other debates of social innovation, which maybe dominate in maybe Western European discourses, where social innovations are rather understood as a kind of a community initiative or something. So it's there, social innovation signifies more or less kind of community empowerment or something. It's somehow also normative. So this is, I don't know. So I prefer the analytical understanding of it. I see a big similarity somehow in the fact that social entrepreneurs are actors who are in an excellent position to foster social innovations, because social entrepreneurs have, on the one hand, an entrepreneurial mindscape. So these are kind of actors who strive to develop novel solutions or novel ideas. So this is very typical entrepreneurial. This is one point, and on the other hand, they usually follow a social mission, so they are aware of occurring social problems in an environment, and they usually also strive to develop solutions to counteract these problems. So, and at the same time, this shows you also the difference between these both conceptions. So while social innovations are rather a subject, an empirical subject that you can observe and takes place, social enterprises or entrepreneurs are the actors who operate or who do these actions or practices. Yeah, and there exists also in the social enterprise debate an understanding that social enterprises itself are a kind of a social innovation. So, for instance, a very famous scholar named Gregory Dees said 20 years ago that social enterprises are kind of social innovation because more or less for the first time in history, a sort of enterprises exist that produces beneficial societal outcomes without being dependent of public money. So these are kind of organizations who earn the money itself that they use for producing social impact. In fact, I got to know several social innovative projects or initiatives, both in German rural places. So for 3 or even 4 years, we conducted research in several communities in all parts of Germany and looked or investigated what are beneficial or hampering factors to establish innovative solutions there. And I was also have been involved in an EU-funded research project and did similar work in several European countries. But this other project was a bit more related to social enterprises as drivers of social innovations. And yeah, I have in mind maybe 2 good examples for social innovations. One is are the so-called Othello Open Technology Labs. Maybe you know it. This is a social enterprise also called Othello in Austria. And in the last years, they have established in mainly villages and small towns open rooms, which are equipped with computers, 3D printers, other technical devices. And these rooms invite people to come, to meet, to experiment, to maybe develop business ideas, maybe also to do repair cafes. Different kinds of events take place there. And what is important that it are open spaces that aim to attract especially talented people or creative people. And the idea behind this approach is to attract especially creative people of living in the countryside and to create places, meeting places for these kind of people. So in order to stop brain drain and foster brain gain. So this is one example, and another example we got to know here in Saxony, federal state of Saxony, in a small village called Treptitz, which is in the northeast of this federal state. And there a whole community, which consists maybe of 120 persons, so it's really a small village, came together and have built up a wastewater system. So this is doesn't sound very sexy, but what is really interesting is that usually the municipality or other official actors prefer that households in these areas, in these remote areas, build their own private wastewater treatment plant. And what is really different is that there the whole community came together and said, okay, it's much cheaper, more effective if we build up 2 group wastewater treatment plants. And they did so. They built it in their village. They had also to connect the plants with the household, so they built up a grid, underground grid, and at the same time they made use of heating energy from a biogas plant from a farm that is nearby, and made use of this energy also for the household, for heating the households. And this is really quite innovative, not only because this is an interesting technological solution, but also to see that it is possible that a rural community comes together and works jointly together to realize such an initiative. What we observe is that social innovations could be successfully established when in communities exist kind of key persons. So these are usually persons who have a certain know-how, who are also embedded in this social, in these communities, and have on the one hand, the knowledge to be aware of problems. This sounds very obvious and clear, but it's you know, if you in your everyday life, it's not very. It's somehow also challenging to realize and identify problems that exist. And on the other hand, these are persons who not only see the problems but also are able to develop and initiate initiatives that fight these problems and to develop solutions. This is important from our point of view. What we also found is that maybe also a sense of community is important, because you know, to make social innovative solutions sustainable, it is important that people adopt these solutions and maintain it somehow. And this takes place when people work together and collaborate with each other. So this is another precondition, I would say. Yeah, maybe another what is also important is that there exist these key persons who have also a kind of persuasive power. So the possibility to convince people of following him and to share this vision, this joint vision. And one measure to do this is to have a good narration also. So arguments that convince people of joining this initiative. So to come back to this example of Treptitz, narrations there was, okay, if you joined our initiative, you know, you contribute to a sense of community. You contribute also to to a kind of autonomy. You know, many villages nowadays have no autonomy at all anymore. So we observe in the last decades a centralization of political power, of resources, and this is really a problem for social innovative initiatives. And to counteract this, this lack of political power is an important argument also to join this. And what we also observe is that people in the countryside, maybe this is also a difference to people in cities, are willing to follow when they see that it has a practical outcome in terms of it saves money and it really works at the end. So this is also important to show, okay, if you join our initiative, you can save money and have a very effective solution for your problem.